Hello, and welcome to a special report on President Joe Biden's first address to a joint Congress. I'm Jaron Holmes.
And I'm Julia Schneider. This special report is a production of 3 entities of the Jandoli School of Communication at St. Bonaventure University, SBU-TV, Tap into Greater Olean, and the Jandoli Institute.
President Biden will deliver his address to Congress on Wednesday at 9 p.m. The timing of the speech is very unusual, even for a president in the first year of his office. In most years, the president delivers a State of the Union address in late January, occasionally early February.
New presidents do not deliver State of the Union speeches in their first year in office, but have traditionally spoken to a joint session of Congress much earlier in the year. The president also waited until March 25th to host a press conference again. This was much later in the year than usual.
Reporters have been frustrated by the lack of direct access to the president and the tight control the administration keeps on messaging. On the other hand, the Biden administration has reinstated the daily press briefings, which gives reporters an opportunity to question Press Secretary Jen Psaki on any topic.
The president's speech will take place about 100 days into his term, and he is expected to tout his accomplishments on vaccines, the stimulus bill, and other initiatives. He is also likely to lay out his agenda both short and long term.
To learn more about what to expect from the speech, we will be speaking to 2 political experts, Dr. Mary Rose Kubal, chair of the Political Science Department at St. Bonaventure, and Dr. Richard Lee, an associate professor in the Jandoli School, who also serves as executive director of the Jandoli Institute and co-editor of Tap into Greater Olean.
Dr. Kubal and Dr. Lee will share their insights on what to expect in the president's speech and what it means for his agenda. But first, let's take a look at some of the stories making headlines across the nation. Just hours ago, the CDC says fully vaccinated people can gather outdoors without a mask. The new guidelines released Tuesday provide comfort to fully vaccinated people when attending small get-togethers with friends and family. The CDC says fully vaccinated people should still wear a mask when attending large crowds and where social distancing is not available.
There are many situations where fully vaccinated people do not need to wear a mask, particularly if they are outdoors. If you are fully vaccinated and want to attend a small outdoor gathering with people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated, or dine at an outdoor restaurant with friends from multiple households, the science shows if you are vaccinated, you can do so safely, unmasked.
The new guidelines also state fully vaccinated people, while still wearing a mask, can safely attend worship services inside, eat dinner in a restaurant, and participate in an exercise class.
President Biden is preparing for his highest profile speech yet. Wednesday, the president will be using his address to Congress to tout the administration's COVID accomplishments during his first 100 days in office. More now from CNN's Phil Mattingly.
The president is excited to this week lay out his plan to invest in American families.
His 100th day in office just 3 days away, President Joe Biden set for a look back, but ready to press forward in a major way.
He's thinking a great deal about what message he can send directly to the American people about what progress we've been made, but of course what challenges remain ahead.
With a focus on more than 200 million vaccine doses delivered and more than 160 million stimulus checks deployed.
What you're going to hear from the president is a call to consider these investments and the potential that they would provide for the country.
But it will also set the stage for an ambitious agenda ahead, one centered on transformative economic proposals that would spend more than $4 trillion.
This is his vision for how we need to put in place a public investment agenda for the country.
Biden's set to unveil the second part of that plan, a $1.5 trillion proposal focused on what White House officials call human infrastructure, with hundreds of billions of dollars directed to child care funding, education, paid family and medical leave, and extensions of key tax credits and Obamacare subsidies. But underscoring the complex road ahead, congressional Democrats have been furiously lobbying behind the scenes over the scope of the plan, officials tell CNN. And the forthcoming proposal has already drawn sharp criticism from Republicans for the tax increases on the wealthy the plan will include, something the White House sought to defend today.
The reforms that the president will lay out are focused on this top sliver of people and treating capital gains the same as wages for that top 0.3%.
White House officials make clear the pandemic will remain a focal point, with Biden set to press Americans to hang on for just a little bit longer and get vaccinated as soon as possible.
I think you're going to see increasing steps over the next few weeks on what vaccinated Americans can do.
As administration officials seek to incentivize a process that has started to slow as eligibility has opened up for adults nationwide.
As we've mentioned, President Biden makes his first address to a joint session of Congress on Wednesday. Because of COVID protocols, attendance is going to be somewhat limited. The White House is still working with both chambers of Congress to determine how the event will work.
The Getting America Back on Track tour starts Thursday. President Biden and Vice President Harris will visit nearly a dozen states, highlighting their first 100 days in office. The president will be in Atlanta on Friday and then off to Philadelphia. Harris will start things off in Baltimore Thursday before heading to Ohio. They will be pitching to America an ambitious economic legislative agenda which calls for more than $4 trillion in spending for infrastructure, jobs, education, and healthcare. America stood in silence as a Minnesota judge read the verdict in a trial that captured the attention of the entire country. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin guilty on all charges in the death of George Floyd in May of 2020. Chauvin placed his knee on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes, cutting off air circulation. President Biden has been vocal at the need for social reform and the respect for all races.
When we come back, we will be joined by St. Bonaventure political science professor Mary Rose Kubal and her analysis on what we can expect from the president tomorrow.
Stay with us. Our address to Congress coverage continues right after the break.
Hey world, I have a quick message. It's about safe driving. All right, let's go. Anytime you're driving, have the seatbelt buckled tight, both hands on the wheel and your phone out of sight. When not in your hand, trying to text somebody back, because if you do, your car might get smacked. The moral of the story, just put your phone down. The people on the road will stay safe and sound. Put your phone down, put your phone down. People on the road will stay safe and sound. Yeah.
Every day,
millions of people are connecting. Father,
cosplayer,
mentor,
actor. It's time we take a step forward, come together,
and discover
how accepting our differences
can make us stronger.
If doctors, nurses, and grocery store clerks can wear a mask for 10 or 12-hour shifts, you can wear a mask for an hour or less when you go to the store. Do your part. Be New York tough. Mask up, America.
What to expect when you're expecting.
Like here.
A teenager.
Today, I'm going to show you how to teen-proof your home. First step, hide the car keys. Preferably somewhere they would never look. Challenges will come up. Be ready for them. Hi, honey.
Ready for the... Mom, you don't use mannequins in the mannequin challenge.
You don't have to know it all to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same.
Special coverage. Address to Congress.
Let's get into some analysis. We are joined this segment by St. Bonaventure political science professor Mary Rose Kubal. How are you doing today, Professor Kubal?
I'm doing well. It's a beautiful day.
You've been following the start of the Biden administration closely. From your observations, what are the issues you feel the president wants to talk about?
I think just as in your teaser running up to this, clearly he's going to want to talk about the COVID response, right? I mean, that's been their messaging from day one, right? Jim Psaki's been saying, the president gets up every day and it's COVID, COVID, COVID. Obviously, they've met their vaccine goals, so that's going to be something he's definitely going to be talking about. It'll be interesting to see, with the new developments, whether he's still going to go with that July 4th. Hopefully, we can all celebrate Independence Day without masks. But he's definitely going to want to talk about the COVID response, and he's going to fold that into the infrastructure bill, right? That's really what, he and Vice President Harris are going to be, then they're going to be kicking off that tour on Thursday, and they're really going to be, it's about, that's their their legislative agenda right now is really focused on tying that COVID response into infrastructure and human infrastructure. So I think he's trying with the messaging to roll in some things that the Democratic base really wants, like childcare and healthcare, maybe some tweaks to the Affordable Care Act, but framing it in a way that's not going to be so controversial. Like they don't want a health care bill, because we know what happens when we start debating health care, right? So I think it's going to be, the main focus is going to be on the infrastructure bill. And I also would be interested to see what he says about climate. Obviously, they're just coming off of that Earth Day summit. I mean, there's some pressure from the international community to get actual congressional action and legislation on this. They're not, right? The Obama administration promised some things, and that was rolled back by the Trump administration. But both the infrastructure and climate agenda is tied into jobs, right? And Biden really likes to talk about jobs, because that's something that, who doesn't like jobs, right? Conservatives like jobs, liberals like jobs, everybody likes jobs. So I think I expect that he will talk about climate, perhaps in the context of infrastructure. So those are the things he wants to talk about. Obviously, there's some issues he's not going to want to talk about so much, but I think he's going to have to address. So,
next question: what are the issues he doesn't want to talk about? How will he handle them?
Right.
And will he ignore these topics or work them into the speech?
So yeah, that's interesting, because I do think foreign policy hasn't been high on his agenda, but I think he's probably going to have to talk about, right, the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, and he has been talking about that a little bit. I mean, that's certainly not unpopular with his base, so he'll probably give a nod to that. It's going to be really hard for him to avoid talking about the Iran nuclear deal, and it'll be interesting to see if he makes any references to the recent Israeli attack on the Iranian nuclear facility. I'm suspecting he would rather not get into that in this address. So I'm curious as to how he's going to handle that, but I don't see how because he's been in negotiations to revive that, the nuclear deal, so it'll be hard for him not to at least mention that. I don't know what he's going to say about Israel, so that'll be interesting. And then obviously the border and immigration, the messaging on that has been bad. It has not been good, and there hasn't been much of it, and it seems like Biden has mostly handed that off to Vice President Harris. So I do expect he's going to have to say something, but I don't expect him to spend very much time at all on the border and migration. And it'll be really interesting to see is it a crisis? Is it not a crisis? They've been walking some things back. So it'll be interesting to see what the messaging is on that. And then obviously, Black Lives Matter, police reform. Again, I mean, I think this is something that he clearly ran on in the campaign. It's something he can't avoid talking about right now, especially with the Chauvin verdict and the recent police killings. He and Vice President Harris spoke to the nation on the day of the George Floyd verdict. But he's going to want to stay away from any more, he's not going to mention defund the police. That will not be in there. He's going to talk probably about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that passed the House in early March. And probably, I mean, the framing that they've been using has been pretty consistent, basically around police accountability and addressing systemic racism in police departments. So I expect him to keep it pretty vague and keep the messaging on point in terms of police accountability, and kind of just sort of throw it back to the Senate, because a lot of this address is about his legislative agenda, going public, right, trying to get support for certain things. And he and Vice President Harris have been pretty consistent about that piece of legislation. So I think he'll be putting in a plug for that as well. So yeah, I think those are probably the main issues.
Going off that, the speech will come a little after a week after the Derek Chauvin verdict. He and the vice president addressed the nation that night. What message do you expect him to deliver about systemic racism?
Well, as I was saying, I think he's going to frame it in terms of accountability. And obviously there's this counter narrative that's been emerging from activists, which is, accountability is not justice, right? It's important, it's a good first step. And that's going to be a tricky one because I'm not sure that Biden, it's a complex issue in some way. Well, it's a complex for the president. And I think it's because he doesn't want to be branded at, he's very much depended on the African American vote to get into office, right? And African American activists and others, Black Lives Matter, they want movement on this, right? They want action. And I think that's like his strategy, sort of punt it to Congress and be like, well, there's this, George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which will ban, some specific practices like chokeholds and no-knock warrants and things, but it, profiling based on race and religion. I'm not sure how much he's going to want to get into the weeds on what's in there. And I think he's going to try and keep it framed in terms of, like we don't like racism, right? It's tough because he's also, he's a union guy, and the police unions are still very powerful. So he's in a kind of a tough spot here, I think, with the messaging on a racial reckoning and police reform. It's going to be impossible for him to satisfy his base and the police and those who think that we don't need to address these issues. So I think he's got a tough needle to thread on that. But probably the best, honestly, I think it's probably pretty smart for him to just, there's some good stuff in that bill. And if and there's also, quite frankly, besides the symbolic, his bully pulpit and the messaging, it's most of the police reform has to take place on the state and local level, because most police departments are not under federal jurisdiction. So I think Biden's going to probably try to keep the message pretty simple, talking about holding police officers accountable, and probably most police officers are good people, that sort of thing. I think he'll we just want to stop some of these these practices. So yeah, I think that's probably what we can expect from him on.
Keep moving forward. The president needs a bounce in public opinion polls. Will this speech do it for him?
I'm skeptical. So looking at the 538 data, he's held pretty steady since the beginning of his term back in January at about 53 to 55% approval. But his disapproval rating, is high as well, which is like since March, it's hung out from about 39 to 41%. So it's going to be hard to move there's not much they use about maybe 5% of Americans that he's got to sway. Back in January, I think the disapproval ratings were a little lower, maybe around 35%. Maybe he could swing some of those folks back, but I think this is just reflective of the polarization right now in our politics and our society. So he needs a bounce to get this legislative agenda through, and I'm not sure that he's gonna get. I think he might get a small bounce, and some of it is like the question is where, right? Because who's gonna watch this speech, right? How is Fox gonna report on it versus MSNBC versus CNN? Because most people aren't going to watch the speech. Most people are going to hear about it on a local news broadcast or through social media, and it'll be interesting. So some of it is like, it's interesting to see for those of us who are going to watch the entire thing, how the president and obviously his speechwriters are trying to lay out his message. But then it's also going to be really important to see how that is framed in the reporting on it, because most people aren't going to watch the address and that, whatever Fox says or whatever MSNBC says, that's, for them, that's going to be, okay, that was the messaging. Do I like it or not? And I don't think that, it's going to be framed much different than anything, right? I don't see him getting that much of a bounce. Well, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think things are so polarized, and those disapproval ratings are just, they're hard to move. I don't see him necessarily winning over folks. And then it's like, where? Because it's really the Senate that he, so, I mean, in the House, sure, he might be able to move some of those, suburban voters in Republican districts. That might help a little bit, but he's like right at the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed the House. Most of what he needs to get through, it's the Senate that's going to be the issue. And I don't, his going public, it's going to be really hard. He's not going to sway people in, in red states enough that I think their senators, are going to be moved to break ranks and not vote with their party. So I think it'll be interesting to see. I expect maybe, if he's at about 54% approval rating right now, maybe he might get up to 56, 57, and that might last for a week. But I don't think it's gonna, I don't think it's gonna be the bounce. We'll see. I think the tour, the messaging that comes out. I mean, if he gets the messaging more consistent, right, especially on things like immigration and the border, and he's able to, set the tone for the tour where they're really going to be plugging the infrastructure bill. I mean, I think what's going to be more important is, getting Senator Manchin in West Virginia and some of the more conservative or Democrats in the Senate to buy into his his human infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but healthcare, childcare. And if he can do that and get that through, then that gives him a bounce to maybe tackle some of these other more difficult issues where there's so I mean, I think they're smart. I mean, everybody likes infrastructure, right? Even conservatives want to bring the bacon home to their district. So I think it's probably politically quite smart to start with a bill that is, and also, even if you don't like it, it's more about, the debate is about less emotional things like fiscal policy, taxing and spending. It's not about, you hate the police, reverse racism, blah, 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 security issues, immigrants coming in, whatever, ruining our country. These sort of emotional hot button issues that I think he's gonna obviously have to tackle. But I think for the first 100 days, I think it's been pretty smart to keep the messaging on this kind of bill that, there's something in there for everybody. It's more that the traditional pork barrel politics, less emotional. So we'll see. I mean, so I think it's less this address. I mean, we'll see if this sets the tone well for the tour. But I think it's more going to be getting that infrastructure bill passed. And if it's popular, there's stuff in there that people likes. That should give him a bounce. It's the results that people want to see. I mean, the expectations for any president these days are unrealistically high, I think. And so he's going to need a pretty big legislative win. I mean, he did get that second round of stimulus through pretty big. People have, right, as you reported earlier, gotten checks. St. Bonaventure's going to get some nice funding, a higher ed. People are and institutions are going to see this, so that's good. That's a win. So if you can get infrastructure bill through, some results on climate tied to jobs, that might give him a bounce that he needs to tackle the more controversial issues that he's not going to be able to avoid. But the messaging hasn't been so great the first
Professor Kubel, thank you so much for your time this evening. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
And when we come back, Jandoli School Associate Professor Dr. Rich Lee will join us for his thoughts on tomorrow's address to Congress. Please stay with us.
People do some pretty cool things in their 40s and 50s. Why should saving for retirement be any different? So wherever you are in your retirement savings journey, head to aceyourretirement.org and start chatting with Avo today. That's aceyourretirement.org.
Before we celebrate the freedom most Americans have, we must fight for the freedom all Americans deserve. Because all lives can't matter until Black lives matter.
Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us.
We are joined by Associate Professor in the Jandoli School of Communication and editor of Tap into Greater Olean, Dr. Rich Lee. Thank you.
Dr. Lee, we've spent some time discussing the topics we expect the president to touch on. Let's talk about the speech itself. Can you give us some context about presidential speeches and why they remain important, even today when we have so much technology and communicate with each other in far different ways than we have throughout American history?
Well, Julia, it's really almost for 100 years, going back to 1913. President Woodrow Wilson gave the first State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. And ever since then, it's really been an American tradition. A little bit different this year, as you noted. In a president's first term, it's not technically a State of the Union address. But actually, there's no legal or constitutional requirement for a president to do that. The Constitution is kind of vague on that. It says the president shall from time to time report on the State of the Union. It doesn't say he has to call Congress together and do a big event the way that we have. So technically, he could fulfill the constitutional obligation by, sending a memo to Congress or even doing an email. But as a nation, we like all the fanfare that goes with an event like the State of the Union address. Think about, sports. We can watch them on TV, we can follow them on our phones, but we like to be in the arena. The same thing with music. We'll buy music, we'll listen to it at home or on our phones, but we want to go to a concert and really hear those artists perform in person. Peggy Noonan's a speechwriter who I really admire. She was a speechwriter for President Reagan and later for President George Herbert Walker Bush. And she wrote a book that I use sometime in class, and she really explains why, despite all the technology, or because speeches still are important. She says a speech is it's one man on a bare stage with a spotlight. He tells us what he wants and how he's going to get it. And she also made the point that speeches have been a constant in American history. That they tell us a lot about who we are as Americans. And I believe that's what the president is going to do in his joint address to Congress.
You've written speeches for elected officials. If you were working on the president's speech today, how would you approach the task?
Well, Jaron, I think I would approach it much like any other speech, so do some of the basics in speech. And the first thing I would make sure of is that it's written in a way that President Biden, portrays himself as himself. Sometimes speech writers or consultants get carried away. They try to craft a new image or reinvent someone's personality. And Joe Biden's been in the public, spotlight, for over 50 years. We know who he is, so we don't need to reinvent him. I'd also be conscious of the audience, which is always important, but here it's a bit different. There's the audience in person in the House chamber, but his larger audience is the American people who are going to be watching the speech. So he's really speaking to them as well. And any good speech should have a message that you weave throughout the whole speech. And if I were writing the speech for him, I would stress a message of reassurance. The country's been through a lot in the past 12 months, and I think he almost needs to take a fatherly tone and say, look, I know things have been tough. I know we've been through a lot, but there's light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm the guy who's going to bring you out of that. And if he's comfortable, I would ask him to work in some of his personal narrative. He's a man who at 30 years old was elected to the U.S. Senate, then a terrible tragedy. His wife and young daughter were killed in an accident. He had a successful career in the Senate. He lost his son, Bo, to brain cancer. He had another son battled substance abuse. So he can say from a personal standpoint, I know what it's like to face challenges, and I've dealt with them, and that can translate to what I can do for the nation.
I'm sure you plan to watch the speech, but many Americans will not. What does this say to you, and how do we fix it?
Well, I think the quick message, the initial response is it says that people are turned off by politics, and I believe that that's true. But we also have to think, we talked about technology earlier. Today people have a lot more choices for what they can do, what they can watch on Wednesday night. 15, 20 years ago, the speech was on every television station, every radio station. So that's true. And also we have the ability to watch the speech later. Again, 15, 20 years ago, if you didn't watch it live, you missed out on the opportunity. But people blame politics, they blame the media, and certainly both of those fields have room for improvement. But I like to put some of the onus on the public too. We have a responsibility as Americans. We live in the greatest country in the world. To make a proactive effort to get involved. So to fix it, I would say there's three parts of the equation. It's the political world, it's the media world, but we can't forget about our responsibility as citizens.
Thank you for your time this evening, Dr. Lee. As a reminder for everyone, President Biden's speech to address Congress will take place tomorrow evening at 9 p.m. You can watch the address on all major networks: ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. Follow Tap into Greater Olean and SBU-TV on Twitter for the latest updates during the address. As is tradition, the president's speech will be followed by a member of the other political party. Republican Tim Scott, a U.S. Senator from South Carolina, will deliver the GOP response to President Biden's address to Congress. Scott served as a senator since 2013. He previously was a member of the House of Representatives.
Thank you for joining us today for our special presentation and our address of the address to Congress.
We would like to thank the Jandoli Institute, SBU-TV, and Tap into Greater Olean for their efforts in today's broadcast. I'm Julia Schneider.
And I'm Jaron Holmes. Have a great night. Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you.